Morning. As I was sitting here, I really had a poignant moment. And the poignant moment was this, that this morning I'm speaking with my first nutrition teacher, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, who I could still listen to. I'm such a little devotee of his work, and he's taught me so much that's become who I am. And then I'm also teaching with two of my students who have taught me so much. And so it's such, when it feels like this kind of passing of the baton, but I also have this sense of, you know, how brilliance skips a generation, and like I'm stuck in the middle. So there we go. But anyways, very poignant about kind of the passing of time and really kind of how we keep passing these things down. And Jeff was talking about the way that, you know, we inherit these genes, and also, but we inherit who we are from the mentors whose shoulders we stand on. And so always recognizing that we don't do any of this alone, and we too are a network. I was given this topic, nutritional genomics, personalizing clinical application, and like many of you in this room, I actually graduated from school more than 5 years ago, and so none of us were taught any of this. And so even though I've made a lot of attempts to learn nutritional genomics and to try to understand as much as I can, I was like, well, this is really interesting. Like, why am I being asked to give this? And I think because I'm like so many of the rest of us, it's new to us, fairly new, and we're struggling to figure out what works and what doesn't really work. So our objectives is kind of what's going on, and then what do we do with it? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. We know, and we heard from Dr. David Perlmutter yesterday, we know that we have, that our genetics, that our human genome, it compromises 1% of the DNA that's in our body. And the microbiome is 99%, and that doesn't include the microvirome or the microfungome or all the parasite DNA that lives in our body. And so when we start looking at all that, it's like, wow, what are we really manipulating? And so I look at it and I go, well, what we know really changes the epigenome, which is not our phenotype, but not our genotype, but our phenotype, right? Our genotype is like having a computer, and the genotype is the software that we put on that computer. And you know, you can do lots of different things with software, and not everybody's going to do them the same way. And so what we know affects our phenotype is really the environment that we're bathed in. And it's the environment that we're bathed in as adults, and Dr. Bland was saying that's really important, but also the environment from early childhood and early. And so, you know, one of my bandstands that I've been on for a really long time is preconception planning. I think it's so important to look at organic acids and to look at parents before they become parents and say, let's look at your family history and let's look for cancers and mental health issues and things that might tip us off that, or you've had repeated miscarriages, might that point out methylation issues. Let's kind of look at your genomics, let's look at your toxic exposures, let's look at what you've been bathed in, and let's see if we can do this ahead of time to really figure out kind of what's going to optimize your environment, the sperm and the egg, and the uterine environment to actually make a place, an environment that really modulates the genome in such a way that it's of the most benefit to a baby. Okay? I also wanted to talk about this because, shamelessly, this is my new granddaughter a couple months ago. Okay, so, but also, I also want to kind of think about, have any of you ever seen the movie Gattaca? Okay, so in the movie Gattaca, you've got a society, which I highly recommend seeing it. It's very dystopian and I kind of love it. I've seen it a lot of times, but it's about a time in, a point in time that's in the future where when babies are born, their entire genome is looked at. And I think that that's going to come, and I think that's going to come not too far in our future, that we're going to kind of take a look and we're going to figure out how to actually optimize the environment for these new beings that are coming onto our planet. So I think that's really exciting. In the movie Gattaca, they took it to real extremes. And at birth, you were put into a caste system. Oh, you are going to go to college and you're going to excel and you're going to be one of the elite, or sorry, you're going to be one of the worker drones. Okay? And the whole movie is about a worker drone who said, no, I don't want to be a worker drone. And somebody who was part of the elite, who was paraplegic, trading identities so that the worker drone could then come to his own potential. And that's really, you know, about what I think is the promise of this, is really about our potential. And that's what's exciting to me about all of this. But I'm hoping that we don't use it for kind of the worst, which is to categorize people and put people in boxes and say, oh, you know, we're going to do this in utero and you've got defects, so we're just going to abort you. You know? So anyway, so I digress. But watch the movie. It's really cool. We know from twin studies that the epigenome changes dramatically, and the top, if you kind of look at this center row with the pretty pictures, these are 3-year-olds, and what you can see is that in 3-year-olds, you've got a lot of concordance in kind of what the expression of their genome, but in 60-year-old identical twins, you start seeing that there's a discordance. And we know, for example, that you can have identical twins, one who's more grossly obese and one who's thin. You can have one who has type 1 diabetes and one who doesn't. You can have one who's got autism and one who doesn't. So there's a lot more in this environmental picture that's really important. And if you read Our Stolen Future by Theo Coburn, one of the interesting pieces that she writes about is placement of rats or mice in utero, and how close they were to the umbilical cord source, food source, determined different things about their epigenetic, the genetic potential as well. And in her case, she was talking really about how much estrogen they were picking up and how many xenoestrogens they were picking up from being in utero. So I think there's still a lot that we want to learn about it, but we know that it's really our environment more than our genetics that really predetermine some of this. And then we get to nutritional genomics, which Dr. Bland went through so eloquently. And we know that food is information. So we got colorful food on both sides of this slide. And I think everybody in the room would know that you get different benefits and you feel differently when you eat the food on the left side versus the food on the right side, right? So colors in food are good. Some colors are better than other colors. And we know that there's bioactive components in food. We talked about those kind of extensively. And how many of you were here for the rest of the week? How many of you weren't here this week? Oh, a couple, okay. Anyway, Dr. Deanna Minnick really talked about bioactives in food. And we've started looking at some of these bioactives. Well, I haven't, but researchers have started looking at some of these bioactives. And what they can see is that, for example, you've got hesperidin from tomato and fluoridin from apple and lycopene from tomato are methylation inhibitors. And then you've got methylation and histone deacetylase inhibitors in coffee, cinnamon, turmeric, tea, soybeans, and broccoli. And then you've got HDACs, histone deacetylator inhibitors in cashews and resveratrol from grapes and garlic. So we start looking at the components that actually are in food that start changing the genetic expression. And this is kind of like a red herring, but I was interested in kind of like these histone deacetylators, which kind of stop the action of acetylation and kind of stop the transcription of what's going on of certain genes. And so I started looking at a paper and was looking at some of the drugs that are used that are HDAC inhibitors for lymphomas, and they're used in lots of different types of cancers as chemotherapies. But then you start looking at butyric acid and butyrate, or allicin from garlic, or sulforaphanes from the cabbage family foods, or quercetin from onions and apples, or others that are likely HDAC inhibitors like vitamin E, biotin, and alpha-lipoic acid, and go, well, if we change our diet, we change our gut microbiome, again, we start changing the environment, and maybe some of these can be used in place of some of these medications. Will they be as strong? Will they block this as strongly? No, but they'll also have lower downstream side effects. And one of the things Dr. Bland has taught me is that, the medicine of the future might be pharmaceuticals mixed with nutrients and herbs and food bioactives. And the reason is because we can hit so many more mechanisms and use smaller amounts of drugs to do the same thing with fewer side effects. So starting to look at some of these areas. And then we have some of our early research into nutritional genomics and how it really works. So this is a research study that was published in 2008 by Dean Ornish and his group, and basically what they did was they took men who had slow-growing prostate cancer and they put them on the Ornish program. The Ornish program is a mostly vegan diet, very low fat. They did stress management, which consisted of yoga and meditation every day. They walked 30 minutes almost every day. They were in a support group once a week, so they did this with the community. And they took some antioxidants and had some soy protein or tofu and some fish oil and a little bit of, and they just kind of looked and they said, well, what's going to really happen here? And what they found was that when they did a heat map of their genetic expression, and you can see on the left side, you've got kind of the pre-intervention and you see more red, and on the post-intervention, you see more green. But what they demonstrated was that you could upregulate almost 50 cancer protective genes and downregulate over 450 oncogenes through diet and lifestyle. It's the first time we've ever seen this. This is remarkable, right? It's like, wow, it's your environment. How long did this take? 12 weeks. They did a follow-up study with these men 5 years later, and they still had increased telomere length. Now, telomeres are like the little end caps on your DNA, and as they get frayed and they unravel, your DNA gets less and less able to do its job, and we end up with more, we age faster and life is going to be shorter. And so they're like the little ends on the shoelaces, is how they're always described, those little caps. And after 5 years later, these men had increased telomere length. So again, changes in lifestyle can help with genetic expression. And this was really a fundamental research study, and I wish that we had a lot more like it, but we don't. This is one by Dr. Randy Jertle and Ellen Dolinoy in their group at North Carolina, Michael Skinner, and basically some of you are probably familiar with this, but these are agouti mice, and they're bred to be fat, obese, and diabetic, because they can do research on obesity and diabetes in them. But in every litter, you get like one little brown mouse who's not diabetic and not fat. So the researchers said, well, let's see what happens if we expose these pregnant moms to bisphenol A. You get more diabetic and obese mice in every litter. let's give them some methylation cofactors, B6, B12, folate, and betaine, and let's see what happens. Wow, you actually protect methylation, and even though you've exposed the moms to bisphenol A, what happens is you still get more brown, slim mice in every litter. So again, it's like what Jessica and Chrissy were talking about is if we can upregulate and help potentiate methylation pathways, then maybe we can help prevent some of the downstream effects of the chemicals that we're exposed to every day. And the bisphenol A, 100% of us have it because every time we pick up a cash register receipt, we got it. Unless you're a millennial and you get everything by email, right, or text. And then Dr. Minnick talked about the Fungenut Study, and basically they took people who had metabolic syndrome and they said, we're going to give you 2 different diets, and your diets are going to either be 25% of your calories is either a rye pasta or wheat, oats, and potatoes. And so basically they had these people with 2 different diets. They had the same fiber content, same calorie content. And what they found was that in these 20 people who they did gene arrays that looked really at the downstream metabolites that you could manipulate and look at for insulin, like growth factor, insulin receptors and sensitivity, hormone-sensitive lipase, and other kinds of genes that are involved with metabolic syndrome. In the rye pasta group, they downregulated 71 of these genes, and in the wheat, oat, potatoes, it made those people 62 genes were upregulated to make metabolic syndrome worse. Now, this research study was done in Scandinavia. What if we had done the same research study in Ireland, where genetically people have been eating oats and potatoes for 1,000 years or more? Would we get the same results? I don't know. Nobody's actually done that research. And so when you look at these, you have to kind of say, well, this is really exciting. You can change the way your genetic expression is by changing the way you eat. But what we don't know is this different in different ethnicities, different parts of the world? What else is involved here? So these are really exciting. These are kind of our first studies. I was looking for more and more. I'm not finding them. We also know from the Mediterranean diet, from the Predimed study, which has spawned hundreds of research papers, that from eating on a Mediterranean diet, eat high olive oil, high nuts and seeds, high vegetables and polyphenol-laden foods, that you do get change in genetic expression, in SNP expression, and gene expression. And then we've got some research that's on some specific applications. So we heard a lot about MTHFR 677T, and people who have the TT genotype have this compromised ability to use folate. And what they did was they gave 83 people who had hypertension little tiny bits like RDA levels of riboflavin for 4 months, and they lowered blood pressure by doing that. So you're going, well, riboflavin, well, that's that FAD, right, that Chrissy and Jessica were alluding to. So the story is we can use these things. We have to kind of start using them in very specific ways. And then we can kind of look. One of the case studies some of my master's students were doing for a while was on cancer, and they were bringing in cases. And what I would look at family histories, and I would see histories of miscarriage, stillbirths, depression and mental illness, cancers. And I'm going, okay, well, we know that there's something in all these pathways that's out of whack on a genomic level, on an epigenetic level, and maybe we can support that. And so that's the exciting part of all of this, is that when we look at these SNPs and when we look at these symphonies of SNPs, we can start saying, what are the actionable things that we can do that we know? And we know, for example, in celiac disease, 99% of people who have celiac disease have either the HLA-DQ2 or HLA-DQ8 genotype. Doing gene typing, though, isn't that useful because about 40% of us in this room also have those gene types. So according to Dr. Alessio Fasano, in order to develop celiac disease, you not only need to have the gene, you need to have the gluten and the wheat and the gliadin, and you also have to have a leaky gut, and probably also some other insult. But if you have only 2 of those 3, not going to develop celiac disease. So our genes are not our destiny, it's our environment and what we do with that destiny that's so important. And then we heard about the ApoE4 genes and the ApoB genes, and we know that there's an increased risk for certain typings with cardiovascular disease and stroke and Alzheimer's disease in people who have the ApoE4 alleles. And alleles are more like hair color. Their SNPs are in 1% of the population, but alleles are more like being a redhead or a blonde or having gray hair or brown hair. There's only a few types of them, and they're much more prevalent in the population. So you can get your ApoE type test done. You can get that done through one of the specialty labs or through Quest or LabCorp or pretty much any lab in the country. And it can tell you some things. And also vitamin D, knowing your vitamin D receptors is also something that can be really useful. And then we get into genomic testing. It seems like about every month I get an email about a new test. Any of you notice that? There's a lot of them out there. And as Jessica and Chrissy pointed out, these are not functional tests. Dr. Bland talked about it too. These are tests that say, well, you were born, and if you imagine yourself as like a dike, like a dam, you have thinner places in your dams and you have thicker places in your dams. And where your dams are thin, you have the opportunity to say, well, let's plaster some more concrete on that by meditating every day or taking more B vitamins or eating more vegetables or whatever we know about what those SNPs are, and we can support those weak places in your dam or your dike so that you can be supported so that when the tsunami comes, it doesn't break out your dam. And that's really what we're looking to do. So who can benefit? And I want to say my husband is this really big proponent of something called the 80-20 rule, which kind of goes through everything in life. And my guess is that 80% of, for those of you who are in clinical practice, 80% of the people who come to see you, you can figure out a lot of what you need to know, and you can really help people by just being a good clinician. Doing testing, listening carefully, doing a nutritionally oriented physical, really being a good clinician. For the 20% who you're just going, I'm mystified, we've done all the things we know to do, this is where I think genomic testing really starts playing an important role, is at least at the moment. So it's for those people, and for those of us in clinical practice, it would be so nice. Like in the beginning of my practice, people would come in and say, I'm tired, or I'm tired, or I have PMS, or I just want to lose 20 pounds. Now you get people, they're like tired, they want to lose 50 pounds, they have PMS, they're depressed, they have lupus. I mean, we're not seeing people with simple health conditions anymore. And I think the longer you're in practice, the more complex people you start working with. So genomics could be really useful. Also, I think within the next 5 years, there's going to be really important genomic testing for drug metabolism. And I think pharmacogenetics is going to lead the way. I have a student right now, one of my doctoral students was just put on warfarin, and she's had a terrible reaction to it. And it's like, well, didn't they check you first for your cytochrome P450 SNPs to see if you'd be a good metabolizer, if this would be a good drug for you? Things like tamoxifen. I think we're going to start really seeing that there's testing, genomic testing, to see what are the right drugs for you. I think for preconception planning, families with special needs, children with special needs, families who have family histories of cancer, depression, mental health issues, autoimmune conditions, I think, we're not there yet, but I think these are going to be really important. People who want to optimize health, like some of us. I've done a lot of these tests on myself. I still don't know what they all mean, but it's fun to do them anyway. And then the other thing is we heard yesterday, there's a lot of research going on in this area to try to help us figure out what's really going on. So when we do this testing and our research, our data goes into a pool of research, we're helping to figure out what's going to be true 10 years or 20 years from now. So then we have to look on, okay, so what's really going on? And one of the big bugaboos is that there's huge amount of variation from one lab to another because everybody's using their own pioneering techniques to look at all this. And so you do one lab's test and another lab's test and they're completely different. So for example, checking the gut microbiome, you could do, there are two main companies who are doing that, and if you ask me in Q&A, I can say who they are, but anyway, there's two main companies who are doing that, and you get really different results because they're using really different technologies. And so it's kind of like, well, we need standardization. Also, different companies are using different SNPs. They're interpreting, people are having different analysis of data. And we're getting a lot of contradictory information where one company is saying, you're at increased risk for this because of this SNP, and the next one's saying you're at decreased risk. So there's not really a consensus yet about what we know. And then, as Dr. Bland was saying, you can't look at one SNP and say, aha, we know what to do about this, because they work in networks, and they work in networks with our environment. And so, and then we have to look at the person's environment and their microbiota. And we don't have any of this research yet. So anyway, so there are a lot of different tests, and I just wanted to kind of throw out a bunch for you. And I'm running behind time, which is not good. Okay, so like, for example, Genova has 5 panels that look at your detox, your estrogen profile, your immune profile, your neuro, and your osteo, your bone profile. I did one of these in 2002 on myself for my cardiovascular, and what was really interesting, what I found out was things that I actually knew. That ACE inhibitors didn't work well for me, that that I had an MTHFR 677T heterozygous, and which I had discovered when I was 30 years old already, that I needed more folate than the average person, which I won't go into all the details of that right now, but I had some clinical picture that let me know that I really needed more folate. So I started taking more folate and my problems disappeared. So for me, it was a confirmation. That genomic test used, the cardio SNP test right now is 11 SNPs. It's only 11 SNPs, so it can tell you some good information, but it can only tell you 11 pieces of information. Then we've got Dr. El-Sohami's tests from Nutrigenomics, and they have sports tests and general tests, and they can tell you, like, do you have a higher or lower need for certain nutrients or different macronutrients? How well do you metabolize caffeine? But I can tell you, I don't metabolize caffeine well. I already know that from my own body. So some of these things, it's like, I'm not sure. How useful is that? For me, I like to really be in my body and know my body, but I'm a clinical nutritionist. I spend a lifetime studying this and attuning to it. So I could say that people who know nothing about this could be really useful and help motivate some of your clients or patients or yourself to say, I always forget to take my vitamin C. I really should take it every day. Or I should eat more vitamin C rich foods. Add more kiwis to, and acai berries. Then we've got pathway genomics, and pathway genomics has skin, fitness, weight, and cardiac or hereditary cancer panels or pharmacogenetics panels. They generally, for their wellness panels, look at about 73 SNPs, and they give you information on diet and what foods are best for you and bitter taste and all kinds of things. You can learn a lot of really cool stuff about yourself. And then GI Slim is a company that looks at how can you lose weight best, what kind of macronutrient composition is going to work best for you, and they can give you also micronutrient information. And all of these labs, along with giving you a report, will let you talk to somebody who says, well, what do I really do based on this report? Then Great Plains Labs, they were exhibiting here, they have a test that has 1,000 SNPs. So they got relatively a lot of SNPs, and they can look for impairment and enhancement in a huge variety of SNPs. And so this may be kind of one of the newer generation tests, and I think it's a good one. And then we have some of the direct-to-consumer tests. We've got 23andMe. So if you did it early like I did, I got almost a million SNPs tests, 100,000, almost a million SNPs tested. The newer version is about 600,000. Ancestry.com is 700,000 SNPs. Family Tree is about 700,000. You know, so then you can get kind of a broader thing, and you can get these for like $100 or $200, $300. They're not expensive, and they can tell you something. In fact, I have a new cousin because I did this test. The illegitimate son of my dad's first cousin. And so his whole adoptive family has kind of died, and so he's got a whole new family. And so there's some really good things that can come out of doing these. And his first cousins were, this isn't true. And I'm like, well, do your 23andMe. You'll see, he's your first cousin, you know? So anyway, and so you can just do Ancestry for like $99, or you can do $199, or you can do, you know, you can do Ancestry.com or FamilyTree.com, and they'll also hook into all of these other tests that you can run, which is really fascinating to do. So here's some of the tests that you can basically take, 23andMe or Ancestry.com or some of these other sites, and you can take your data from these big data sets and run it through some smaller data sets, and you can get kind of more targeted information about some of who you are and how you work on a genomic level. And one of these is Prometheus. You can plug your information in there, and they can give you, oh gosh, so much information that it's amazing, and it's overwhelming. But if you're really a nerd and you really want to dive into this, you can go into Prometheus and you can look at every SNP, and you can see your genetic predisposition. Like for me, my abdominal risk of abdominal aortic aneurysm is about equally protective and negative. So it's like, well, it looks like it's not too bad. Okay, I'm probably not going to get one of those, you know? So you can kind of look at some of these, and then you can dive deeper, and they give you reports, and you can look at these reports about some of your SNPs and how well those work. And then you can dive even deeper, and you can look into specific numbers and databases and kind of dive deeper. This is kind of, I think this, I'm not sure if it's mine or somebody else's, but you can kind of look and see what's the risk here of celiac disease. And then you can dive even further and look at every single SNP in your genome, all, 500,000 of them, and you can see what's known about them by going into more deeply into the databases. And then you can go into SNPpedia, which is the Wikipedia of SNPs. So like if you find something cool, you can put it there. It may not be true, but this is, but you can play with it because researchers and other people are dumping data into here. And then we have some next generation testing, which starts to look at the symphonies and the networks of these things and starts saying, well, then how do we take these and how do we apply what we know about functional medicine and herbs and food and lifestyle and other laboratory tests, and how do we start putting these all together with the person and their diagnoses and what's going on with them, and then come out with clinical recommendations that then we can look through as clinicians and say, okay, well, this person has 6 diagnoses, and it looks like some of these areas are duplicated in all of them. So we're going to really support this person's dam by building up these particular areas in their networks so that some of these downstream effects won't be bothering them anymore. And so again, these are, oh my gosh, they're barely walking. They're not walking. These are newborns, okay? Because the first one I'm going to tell you about was put together by Dr. Peter D'Adamo, and it's really comprehensive. It's less than a year old. It's less than a year old, and you need to know a lot to get good value out of it, because you still need to be a great clinician to figure out what's most important and what to do. The other one that's not available yet, but coming out, is from Dr. Joe Pizzorno at Salutogeneticists and Salutogeneticists. Thank you. Salutogeneticists. And it's looking at various health conditions, over 200 SNPs, and then also looking at functional lab tests, regular lab tests, and then kind of giving you information about, okay, clinically, here's what we can move. And one of the things I love about this is like, well, if we move this, what's the benefit we're likely to see? And if we move these 3 things, then what's the benefit we're going to see? And you can track somebody over time with it. And it's not even on the market yet. I think next month or soon. So we're starting to see testing that's going to kind of go beyond kind of just SNPs and start helping us in a much more robust clinical way. And I've given you a list of some of the limited labs and resources, and Salutogenesis is here, so you can look them up. I didn't have a slide because I don't have the information on it. So my question is, are we really ready to use these in our practices? And I can tell you, for me, I'm over here, I'm a generalist. I mean, I know a lot about a lot of things, and I know a lot about the gut and the microbiome, and I know a lot about food, and I know just enough about this to be really dangerous, And so I don't know if at this point in my career, I'm actually going to really study this. I'm probably going to send my clients to Jessica and Chrissy, who are experts in this. And so we're going to get specialists. And I think Dr. Minnick talked about this the other day. There are going to be people who specialize in really working with that 20% of the population that we can't really figure out, right? The field is changing so fast, okay? So Dr. Bland said there's a doubling of information every 3 years. When I first heard him say that, it was every 5 years, which means right now, and I've actually heard that there's a doubling of information right now every 2 years, which means that what you know now, in 2 years, you'll only know 50% of what's possible to know. And in 4 years, you'll only know 1/8 of what's possible to know, okay? So for me, that's overwhelming, so I always come back to basics. What do I know that's never gonna change? And I know that working with nutrition and lifestyle is not gonna change, okay? Some of the details might change, but if we can get people to do the basics, 80% are gonna get great results. And that 20%, we need to send them off. So trainings, Dr. D'Adamo, here's a list of some of the trainings that are out there, because you're not going to learn this from a morning on genomics, right? This is something you got to study, 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 and you all have these slides, so I'm not going to kind of go through them. And I know I was talking with Dr. El Sohami, I don't know how to say his name, but He's got a brand new training course that the Canadian dietitians are going to be using, and so it's like, well, I'm curious what's in there. Yeah, Yaffe has one called Manuka, and when you talk to all the different people, they all have criticisms of everybody else's algorithms on how they come up with their training. So again, we don't have a consensus, but you got to start somewhere, and this is where we are. So have we put the cart or the genetic chip before the horse? Okay? And I think, yes, we have, but the horse is already out of the barn. And so, yes, we have, and we need to try to use what's beneficial right now, knowing that in 2 years, what we know now, half of it's going to be wrong. And in 4 years, 80% of it's going to be wrong, okay? And so, but we have to start somewhere, and so we're going to start. So, also I said there's a doubling of new information every 2 years. Right now, there's a doubling of data every year, because you've seen these big data points that they've been showing us this week, and it's like, oh my God, what's going on here, right? Then I just heard that in 5 years, there's going to be a doubling of data every 52 days. And I just went on the website this morning, and there's one site that says there's going to be a doubling of data every 12 minutes. So I don't know, but I can guarantee that none of us are that smart. And so basically, there's a doubling of known sites. So I just kind of was looking at this research paper, and it involved 265 institutions around the world, and they looked at almost 350,000 people's genes, and they looked at 200,000 different gene sites, and to see how many of them really affect hypertension. And up until then, all the research had 90 sites that were 90 gene sites that were associated, SNPs that were associated with hypertension. And in these 2 papers, they added 87 new SNPs, so they doubled the amount. And this is what's really going on. And one of the researchers says, well, even taking all the known variants together, we explain 2 to 3% of blood pressure variability between individuals. So this isn't the whole picture. It's just not the whole picture. So yeah, cart before the horse, but what is usable? So, and then we look and we go, well, each of us has 3 to 4 million SNPs. Each of us has 400,000 insertions or deletions, and we each have about 10% of these larger variations. And I'm somebody who has one of those dominant single gene conditions that runs through my family, And so you look at these and you go, oh my gosh, how are we really going to harness all of this? And I think in 10, 20, 30 years, I think we will really be able to harness it. I don't think we're there yet. Then there's a lot of questions about the ethics. Okay, who owns your data? What can they do with it? We have the 2008, we have a Non-Discrimination Act for genetic information, and it protects us against getting fired from a job or being discriminated for being hired for a job, or health insurance companies can't not accept us for health insurance because of our genes. However, long-term health care and long-term insurance and life insurance, not protected yet. So what if your genetic information gets out, you're not really protected? Let's say that you need to go into a nursing home or whatever. You can't get long-term insurance. There's a lot of, I know that there are a lot of clinicians who are using numbers or false names for people because they don't feel like the data is safe on the internet. These are not necessarily protected by HIPAA. And then, how are we going to ultimately use these? Are we going to do a Gattaca type situation where we use them to discriminate against people? Or are we going to use them for positive things to say, look, these chemicals in our environment are affecting our genome, and they're making us sick and they're killing us, and we're living in a cesspool of our own making. So we really need to clean up our act environmentally. And then what do we do with all the contradictory data? So, we're not there yet. And then there's political issues. Who's going to control this field? Is it going to be the genetic counselors? Is it going to be the MDs? Is it going to be the nutritionists? Who's going to be allowed to actually do this once we start getting insurance reimbursement for some of this, and once we start getting people who are really specializing in it? Like, what's going to happen there? And so I keep coming back to as above, so below. And when I look at the research, so many of the things that make us feel better affect our genetic expression. Wow. So some of the things, so this was a research study, and I'm going to go over time, I'm sorry, but I'm going to, by Stephen Cole and his group at Chapel Hill. And they basically asked people, how often do you feel happy or satisfied? Life feels like it has direction and meaning, and I'm growing to become a better person. How often do I feel sad or depressed? And they made these questionnaires to figure out whether somebody was hedonic, living for the moment, or they were eudonic, living for a larger sense of purpose. And they started looking at that data and they said, okay, well, let's kind of take a look at this. So they put the people who were interested, eudaimonic, in like having a good life and having fun, but also having this greater sense of meaning and purpose. I think a lot of us in this room, we're here because of that greater sense of meaning and purpose. And then they plotted them on general well-being against the people who were hedonists. I'm just gonna drink beer and live for today, and I'm gonna, smoke pot, and I'm just gonna make a lot of money because then I can get a yacht and all that kind of stuff, right? And it doesn't mean that people who are eudonic can't have all those things too, but they also have a sense of purpose. And you can see from this, there was pretty equal sense of well-being, and also total well-being was pretty similar with the two groups. But when they started actually looking at genetic expression and genetic expression of inflammation, the people who had a hedonic lifestyle at their core had more inflammation and more inflammatory gene expression. And the people who were living for a greater sense of purpose and meaning in their lives had less of it. Wow. So this is something we haven't really talked about. But then when I start looking at some of the research, I know you're getting the hook, and I'm almost done. When I look at there's research on yoga and meditation and prayer, and prayer in women, Islamic prayer in women and breast cancer. When I look at the microbiome and I look at conductors, orchestra conductors live longest, music, sound, vibration, running and exercise, forest bathing. How do you feel when you're at Yosemite or in the woods? I took this other day behind my house. And then we can use the functional testing to really help us hone in on all of this. And I'm not going to kind of go through these, but what I do want to show you is that I think that we're really, I want to go back one slide. So we have to look at the whole context and know that these genomics is just a teeny bit of the context. We also have to realize that we are now going down a rabbit hole. Do some of you feel like that? I feel like that. And we need to start looking at these symphonies and networks and start putting them together and say, the answer is not in the SNP, the answer is in the being and the way we live, and in our diet, the way our manner of being. And what we have right now is like driving through a blizzard, and we can kind of get where we want to go, but we don't really have a full picture. And that's really what I wanted to tell you about where we are clinically, in my opinion, with genomics. So thank you, everybody. Thanks.